When 66 municipalities were left hung after the municipal elections in 2021, South Africa was, for the first time, thrust into a national discussion about coalitions. In 2022, the country's significant metros became the battleground for a power struggle between the ANC, EFF and DA. Political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng joins me now for a recap of these events in politics and what we can expect in the year ahead. Asanda, thank you for your time. I know it is a public holiday, but let's dive deep into the question of coalitions. How have they played out in 2022 and what do we learn from them?
Thank you for having me. I think, what's been interesting about the coalition government kind of arrangements that we've seen in the past year and from 2021 when they started is that it's shown that, governments have to be on their toes and political parties have to be on their toes because they are not permanent arrangements. And so they can change quite quickly depending on how the politics are playing themselves out. So we saw, for example, that in Nelson Mandela, it started out with an ANC coalition. And then right now we have a DA coalition. In Ekurhuleni, there was an attempt to remove a DA mayor, and then the ANC and the EFF couldn't agree on a mayoral candidate, and therefore the DA ended up winning it again. And we saw in Johannesburg that there was an attempt to remove the DA, and it looked like it was successful until there was a court case which then brought back the DA mayor. And so the DA seems to be the biggest winner in these coalition governments, but the EFF seems to be the kingmaker or to be enjoying the position of being kingmaker, but it doesn't seem to be kind of consistent in who it supports and why. And so this makes for, at times, very unstable governance, because remember, you need a stable government in order for the people of whatever metro it is to be able to receive the services. You need a good at least year or 2 years of the same people in power. And so what's going to be important, of course, is some election rules around coalition governments, how long they can be in place for, and what are the rules for changing them. Because we've seen, as I've already said, that there was a challenge that went all the way to court, which then led to the reversal of the ANC being in power again in the city of Joburg. And so I think that, as we approach 2024 and we're looking at, the reality and the possibility of coalition governments being something that could happen at a provincial and at a national level, it's going to be important to set some rules around it. It's going to be important to be clear around the boundaries that political parties have and that the various governments that are constituted through these are meant to be in power for, particularly for trying to have some kind of sustainability, particularly for ensuring that there is service delivery regardless of how many times power actually changes hands, because that's what people care about.
Yes, you mentioned the issue of service delivery, so perhaps coalition politics itself being an expression of disgruntlement and unhappiness amongst the electorate in terms of lack of service delivery. So you've spoken about the expediency of coalitions and them not necessarily lasting that long. I mean, you've mentioned Nelson Mandela Bay, there's Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane. They're kind of a hot mess a lot of the time. So how do we kind of build a culture within political parties where coalitions become workable to the point where the public gets the services the public is entitled to in terms of law and the Constitution and just being citizens of this country?
Well, I think it requires a lot of political maturity, because you can't say you will vote this way because of this way and then kind of suddenly change your mind midway. And that's why I'm saying there's going to have to be some rules, even if it's like, whatever coalition government is in place has to be in place for a minimum of a year or something like that. That's going to make sure that, people think about the longevity of the coalition that they're getting into, and that they consider the sustainability and the stability of the actual government and its ability to deliver services as they kind of agree to certain terms. I mean, we saw, for example, in Ekurhuleni that it became a power tussle between the ANC and the EFF over whether the EFF was going to get the mayoral candidate or not, and the ANC agreeing that, they would get the mayoral candidate, and then Zwandile Masema coming in and saying that he's not going to allow that to happen in spite of what his leadership was saying. And so these are the things that are going to be important to iron out. Who can speak to electoral, two coalitions, who can sign on them, and who doesn't have the power to sign on them, because the leadership of the ANC had, to my mind, the power, but here was a regional power broker who decided it wasn't going to happen despite what his political party wanted, and he was disciplined for that, of course, but by then it was too late because the DA, which they had been trying to remove, was already kind of replaced in that particular instance. And so these are the kind of complications and nuances that need to be thought out as we move towards more and more coalition governments. But I think, we often look at coalition governments as not a desirable thing because of the way that they've played out. But I don't think that's fair, because in Germany we've seen that it can work. And I think South Africa, it's good that we've had practice at a municipal level, such that in 2024, when it starts being a possibility for provincial and national, we have some level of experience on how coalition governments can work and what are the things to look out for when you are even signing that deal or creating that partnership. And I think what's also interesting for voters in particular is that political parties are going to have to be very clear in their mandates who they will and won't go with. Because, for example, a political party like the EFF is not is not ideologically compatible with the DA, and yet in coalition government they seem to have found each other. And you would have seen on Twitter, for instance, some people voted EFF saying, I didn't vote for EFF for it to go and be in bed with the DA, who they deem to be colonizers. And so it's very important for political parties to think about what their partnership says ideologically and how aligned it is to their ideology, and the things that, they would have promised their voters would be what they would deliver. Because it is beginning to seem like political parties use coalition governments just to access power rather than, as a way in which they can find each other as political parties and merge and create a better government for the people. So there's a sense in which it can feel like the people are the last thought rather than access to power. And I think that needs to be ironed out. And those are the conversations that political parties are going to need to have, so that people can trust that if I'm voting AFF, I'm not going to find myself kind of with my vote being handed over to the DA or my vote being handed over to the ANC, for example. And you would have seen also with Action SA making various declarations about who they will or won't, be in coalition with, and then backtracking on those, and then coming back and, making the same stand with that they won't go into coalition government with the DA. After having said they wouldn't, they went, and then they came back again, and they didn't. So it's going to be important for political parties to be clear about who they collaborate with and why, and under what conditions, and how do they ensure that what it is that they say they want, or what it is that they trade, I suppose, is going to come to bear. And it's also going to be important for citizens as well to be aware that, the political party that you vote for could effectively hand over your vote to somebody else, and how do you ensure that they consider you and your ideology and your reason for voting for them. So it's going to require engagements between political parties and voters in order for the system to mature in the ways that it needs to. And I think that, it's good that we've had this practice. It's going to put us in a good stead when 2024 comes, and it's going to mean that there's experience which we didn't have before these municipal elections kind of threw us into, the past two municipal elections kind of threw us into coalition governance.
Yeah, I think you are a lot more heartened about what we can learn from the coalitions and how it's been a test run, shall we say, than I may be. But you've spoken about Action SA. In terms of some of the smaller parties, where do they potentially fit in here? The likes of COPE, the Patriotic Alliance, IFP, ACDP, Freedom Front Plus, because some of this is simply a numbers game. You need to kind of band or pair up with another party that's got the numbers to help you strong-arm power out of the hands of your next obvious rival, which I suppose in many instances has been the ANC.
Well, I mean, I think this is what's interesting about coalition governments is that it does give very small political parties who otherwise may never see a mayorship or a speaker position, who suddenly find themselves kingmakers as these bigger political parties are looking for just one vote or just two votes, which they may hold. And so that's why I'm saying I think it's a good thing for democracy, because it allows a multiplicity of voices to be heard, and it allows, for different kinds of ideologies to find space within a government. And it also allows political parties that, as I've said, would never get mayorship or speakership to kind of have a test of what it would be like to be in power or to have, a wider voice. And I think, it's important for the electorate as well to be able to see that a political party like the EFF or COPE or Patriotic Alliance could be in a mayorship, and to see what kind of direction they would take, because that's going to have implications for whether they vote for it again in the next election or not. But as I said, they need to be careful of who they partner with, because in terms of ideology, South Africans still vote very much on ideology. Yes. A marriage between an EFF and a DA could spell the end or a reduction in EFF votes. It could also spell an end or a reduction in DA votes, because there's some people who vote DA who would never want to be associated in any way with the EFF, for example. But it also kind of, I think, reminds us that, these are all human beings who may or may not, be part of political parties, but are essentially South Africans just trying to figure out what needs to be done and what can be done in order to make South Africa work, and in order for governance to be given, a new face and to be tested in various different ways. And I think it's also a testament to the strength of our democratic systems that we are able to have these governments, even though it feels unstable and it feels like there's a shift. The more we do them, the better we're going to get, and the more experience we're going to get, and the more political maturity I think we're going to be able to see. Because would you have thought, 5 years or 10 years ago, or sort of 7 years ago, that you'd ever see an EFF and a DA coalition? No. Or a DA and a PA type of coalition. It seemed impossible. It seemed like something, these political parties were so ideologically far from each other. But through coalitions, we're beginning to see that people are doing what is necessary to come together and make things work under the circumstances that they have.
Certainly a vibrant and dynamic time ahead in South African politics. Asanda Ngoasheng, political analyst, joining us from Cape Town. Thank you very much for your time.